was wanting them to say yes, and they said no. And that is really what these stories are about, where they're able to walk back and forth between the past and the future, and create a unique opportunity, a unique challenge, a unique way of thinking for them. So let me move to the next step here and say, so if I have to think differently, what do I have to do? I don't know what do I have to do, but this is my hypothesis. I don't have any scientific way of measuring, but there are some interesting patterns that seem to be occurring that are common between some of these examples, very different kind of examples. And so I want to kind of put before you these threads and try to tie this together and say, and bring out five thoughts that perhaps might define what goes into thinking differently. And I'm sure you will have many more. I could think of 5, you'll probably think of some more, and collectively we'll probably be able to put together this alchemy of thinking differently. So the first aspect of thinking differently in my mind is to disrupt your thinking. Thinking about jobs and careers, thinking about contribution, thinking about learning, thinking about privileged and underprivileged, thinking about achievement and underachievement, thinking about nation and identity, thinking about relationships, thinking about organizations. We have to disrupt the way we think. We have to kind of experiment in quite some ways. I think much has been written about it, but in most recent times, and one thing I personally don't necessarily think that that's a great way to go, but the idea that seems to have disrupted education in recent times is Salman Khan's academy. That was a very disruptive way of thinking. It's an example of how you think really differently to be able to do what it does, what its impact is. That's history will tell, but it's something to think about. And I also feel that Amul was a classic example of thinking, of disrupting the thinking. When the world said that you can't make powder out of buffalo milk, and here is a group of people who didn't know the technology to do it. None of those people were technology, but they found others who could help them to disrupt their thinking. And I often feel that I personally don't believe anyone who is too sure of his ideas. And what works for one does not necessarily work for others. And when I see myself pushing an idea a bit too hard, I shudder because I feel I'm probably falling a trap that I've set for myself. So I have to, part of this disruptive thinking is to question one's assumptions very frequently. Second aspect which allows us to think differently is about journeys and destinations. I feel journeys are far more exciting, and it's a cliche, but far more exciting than reaching a destination. So we don't do things to just win a contest, but because we enjoy the process. And in that, if we win, great. If we don't, so what? Who cares? And I think it's important to define one's journey. Define one's, and how one journeys is also important, whether one does it through poise, through courage, through compassion. It's very critical to define that journey. Victory and losses happen or don't happen. And I think this is where the Patel Brasswork story and the Akshay Patra have embarked on journeys to nowhere and perhaps everywhere. I don't know what their destination is. I can't read. I don't know if they'll stop tomorrow. I don't know whether Patel Brass Works experiment of creating bearings in 24 hours and shipping it around the world will take them anywhere more than what they are today. But I think it's a very exciting way of walking one's life. and it's very meaningful because, and it's fun to be associated in that sense. I was just talking a little bit earlier with Ambuj that, one of the most quintessential journeymen was Louis Pasteur. Right? I mean, here's a person in 19th century who, when the debate, that debate is still on, when the debate between basic science led by Niels Bohr and applied science and use led by Edison were really occupying center stage. And here is a journeyman who comes in and at the age of 19 starts wondering about the basic science part through crystallography, right? I mean, there is that tartaric acid, he finds isomorphism in there and creates a very interesting basis for crystallography. But at the other end, he's kind of intrigued by why the alcohol from beets is not fermenting properly, and goes and develops the basic science that led to great fermentation. So he's a great journeyman. What comes out of it is absolutely going to be exciting. Whether you reach it, whether you call it a destination or you don't, that's based on your own taste. The third aspect that deals with thinking differently has to do with competition and cooperation. Competition is necessary for success, but it's actually not the sufficient condition. Cooperation becomes the sufficient condition. But it doesn't happen easily, cooperation. It has to be orchestrated, and orchestrated very differently. If you don't benchmark with the best globally, then we decline. But to do that requires enormous support and help from large number of people. And in my mind, Amul tells me that one lesson of how do you compete globally, how do you become best in what you do by creating very different kind of structures and by creating a cooperation between large number of entities, whether in your own organization, which is the farmers and others, as well as the world around in developing new kind of technology. Here, actually, Alexander Dumas' Three Musketeers, there's one very interesting line that comes to mind, right? One for all and all for one. It's very crucial to be able to think of a journey that leads you to cooperate. The fourth idea linked to thinking differently has to do with specialists and all-rounders. In cricket it is a specialist batsman and an all-rounder are both valid positions. But we need to understand intrinsically who we are, whether we are specialists or we are all-rounders. And I feel we should not look for exemplars outside, but look for within ourselves, because modeling on ourselves on others is probably the biggest fall that one can lead up to. And here I wonder if it's better not to be an ideologue, because an ideologue, following an ideologue, is always following someone else's thinking. So the question then becomes, how do I follow myself? How do I follow my own mind, my own heart, my own intuition? And if I do that, then the rest doesn't matter. Where is it? What is it that prevents us from doing that? That one. And of course, the problem arises when naturally talented openers really want to become all-rounders, and then unfortunately in few years get dropped out of the team. Of course, the few gifted ones manage it, but most can't. It's easily. It can be done. It's not that it can't be done, but it means that you have to move from one platform to another, and that requires effort, that requires energy, And that requires a lot of hard work. And if you do that, it's very easy to translate from one to another. Short of that, I think it's a classic case of disaster, trying to switch from one to another without putting the investment behind it. In my mind, Aspironics is a classic example of that kind of mashup. You know, where many skills come together to deliver a very different kind of a product. They did not turn into a generalist or an integrator, this company, but they hired actually a CEO who was a generalist that brought all these specialists together. And the specialists remained specialists, and there was someone else who was kind of putting this mashup together. I mean, it has to be orchestrated in my own mind. It just doesn't happen by itself. The last idea I want to put before you relates to diversity and modernity, and a little bit about our own country. I believe diversity is India's identity, and modernity its future. And diversity is about appreciation of the differences and celebrating them. Modernity is about linking the past to the future. So we must understand both. And here I want to ask you, what is so enduring or timeless about literature, about music, about architecture, about science? Whether it was Firaq Gorakhpuri or U.R. Anantmurthy, both of them, by the way, were professors of English literature, but wrote in their own mother tongue. Or whether it was Kumar Gandharv or Bismillah Khan, both of them actually created new kind of music altogether in their own times. Very different kind of music than what India was hearing at that juncture. Or Homi Bhabha, or S.N. Bose, or J.R.D. Tata, who managed to break the cordon of global science. These people were very modern. They were not copies of others. They had the courage to think differently. Their local became global. The global didn't become local. Their local became global. And they could easily traverse that bridge which linked the past to the future. In some ways, they were traditionalists, but not self-righteous. So you have to be modern to think differently. But modernity is not about clothing, it's not about jeans and English, it's not about iPad or global travel or global cuisine, it's not even about global literature or global music. It's about values and attitude on compassion and courage. That is modernity. So thinking differently is not about being a contrarian. It's about the process of thinking hard, thinking orthogonally. It's understanding the constraints and then circumventing them through very innovative science and creative humanities. It's actually an acquired taste. It's like Karela, you know. Bitter, enjoyable if you start liking it, and therapeutic thereafter. It's a deliberate act. It requires working at it. As James Joyce in his book Portrait of an Artist, a young man said, with silence, cunning and exile, till it becomes a process. By the way, thinking is also very differently, is also very risky. And more lonely than thinking like others. But then, as they say, what is life worth if it is just to watch others do things? Let me end with a story, and this is a story which also you could reflect on what is happening in our country at this juncture and where lies the hurdle. In recent times, we've had many heroes who have fallen on the ground in every different domain of the society. But they're also very tall people who tell us how character is built. And the story I heard last week from one of the actors in this story. It's about a small public service consulting company called SRI, which was based out of Pune, but it folded in 70s. The operations of SRI was very meager. They were doing public service consulting using very high-end OR kind of modeling. It was set up by an IIM Ahmedabad professor, and it was the people working there were really top talent from the IIMs at that time, who were working there at perhaps the salaries that were the lowest amongst the cohort. But they were doing value-add work nationally, which was perhaps the highest, and that's why probably it closed down. The story is about a young manager at SRI who walked over to his chairman's office and said, you know, half my salary because I don't need more than that to live on. Now, I'm not saying to students who are going to go work to go and ask your manager to half your salary. That was not about it. I'm asking you really to reflect as to whether the making of a character, good or bad, is a function of how one acts and behaves over a long period of time. A collection of actions that start to slowly and subconsciously define who we are. So if a person is born good or born bad, then this world is not very exciting to live in. That's not an enjoyable world. But if one has the opportunity to build oneself into a good person, within quotes, whatever that means, I don't know what it means, it's in the eye of the beholder, then there's hope. And then there's fun because there's the possibility to build goodness, compassion, fairness by thinking differently and behaving differently. And our country at this juncture, and the world for that matter, actually needs people who may slip, all of us slip, but who will fight not to slip. And who may have completely different views of the world, but will respect others who will think differently. That, in my own mind, is the essence of why one must think differently. It's very difficult to own up that you were late because we overslept for a meeting and not because of the traffic. But once you own up, you will see how joyous the world is and how relieved you are and how appreciative others are. This, in my mind, is thinking differently. By the way, the manager was N.R. Narayan Murthy. Thank you very much.